Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Nice to see you all. Thanks for your patience as I.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. So first of all, a little explanation. Last week, I was moving on Monday, and
Wow.
yes, so I was actually planning to squeeze my class in. But when my movers came, they basically just did not let me. So at last minute, I canceled my class and I rescheduled for Friday. I figured by Friday, everything will be okay. Except Friday, I still didn't have internet. So, and I couldn't send out an email that I didn't have internet. So I apologize for the confusion last week, but we're back on track now. And I look forward to having a wonderful class today and going forward. So I welcome myself back and I welcome all of you back. And so let's get started. So this week's Torah portion is in the book of Devarim. It's in the final book. And it is the book that is what we call Mishnah Torah, the second Torah, or the repetition of the Torah, where Moses is essentially reminding all the Jewish people about their obligations before he passes away. And as we mentioned before, this Mishnah Torah takes place literally right before Moses dies, the last month or so of his life. And one of the big preoccupations that we see throughout the Devarim, throughout this last book of the Torah, the one book that is written and given over by Moses. In other words, this is not, as we mentioned earlier, this is not Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, God speaking to Moses to tell the Jewish people. Rather, this is Moses speaking to the Jewish people, his own last will and testament as the leader of the Jewish people, of what he expects of them and what they should be careful of as they enter the land of Israel. And indeed, one of the big preoccupations that we see with Moshe about the Jewish people coming into the land of Israel is the concern that once he dies and once they go into the land of Israel and they become established as a civilization, they will invariably be impacted by the other cultures and the other civilizations that were in the Middle East at the time, and that they would lose the covenant that they made together in the desert at Mount Sinai, the covenant that includes the 10 Commandments and the covenant that includes all the mitzvot, all the laws, all the injunctions that Moses taught the Jewish people throughout the 40 years in the desert when he was leading them to go to the promised land. And indeed, the entire infrastructure of what it means to be Jewish. You know, often people talk about the Jewish people as the chosen people, and people see that as a supremacist term, a term that is perhaps pejorative vis-a-vis other groups. But in fact, this idea of chosen is not chosen because we're better, but chosen because we have a mission, so that we're given a specific mission. And that mission is to keep the Torah and to uphold the Torah and to be a light onto the other nations. And that's why when a Jew publicly violates ethics, it's very hard for the Jewish community, and it's a source of great shame. And you know, people speak about the double standard that's imposed on Israel vis-a-vis, or the triple standard even, that's imposed on Israel vis-a-vis all the other nations, and we complain about it, but truthfully, part and parcel of our mission as Jews is to live up to a higher standard, and that is the standard of the Torah, the standard that Moses conveyed to us in the desert all those thousands of years ago. And so Moses is very realistic. He understands that as he's going to die in the desert, at the cusp of the land of Israel, but he will not be able to take the Jewish people into the land of Israel, that there invariably is going to be a falling away of allegiance. There's going to be a new culture, there's going to be new flavors, there's going to be a new zeitgeist that the Jewish people are going to be influenced by and perhaps attracted to. And the Middle East was rife at that time with idol worship, rife with blood feuds, rife with all types of things that are antithetical to Jewish tradition. And to hold on to the Jewish tradition takes a tremendous amount of discipline and courage and fortitude, because a Jew essentially is swimming upstream all the time. There are times that our culture and our understanding of law and ethics coincide with our societies or parts of our societies. And then we're in a comfortable position, where people talk about the Judeo-Christian ethics. And in certain areas, we can see a commonality where we don't have to give up our tradition because there's a culture that reflects a similar tradition. But by and large, that is like very short spurts of time where there's a kind of coinciding of the values. Most of the time, to be a Torah observant Jew is to go against the tide. It takes a tremendous amount of fortitude, and this is what Moses is very concerned about. And he knows that when he dies, there's going to be a weakness or a blind spot amongst the Jewish people vis-a-vis the cultures that they enter into, especially without Moses there to remind them. And so the entire book of Devarim is this series of exhortations to the Jewish people to say, be careful, don't forget, remember. And so we find that in the book of Devarim, we find this two types of reminders, that one of them forms the most important prayer, which is the Shema Yisrael. So Moses tells the Jewish people over and over again, Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel, hear what I'm saying. And the other, so this kind of auditory tradition, listen carefully. And the other is he tries to visualize and make palpable through something tangible they can see. And he says, look, see here. We find the same type of language in English. We say, listen, are you hearing me? Do you hear me? I hear you. And also you could say, see what I'm saying? And so Moses is using these two languages, Re'eh, see, and that is the name of our parsha today, and Shema. So we find Shema repeated over and over again. Shema Yisrael, listen carefully, O Israel. And then we find Re'eh, see. And in this week's Torah portion, the name of the Torah portion is called Re'eh because the opening words of the Torah portion is Re'eh, see. And what does Moses tell them? See, look at the choices that you have and make the good choices. And overall, the synopsis of this week's Torah portion, where Moses says, see that this is a good way for you. He's saying, see, I place before you a blessing and a curse, good and bad. And the blessing is going to be fulfilled if you do the right things, and the curses will happen if you don't do the right things. The other important teaching that comes out of this week's Torah portion is the law that a temple should be established, a sanctuary should be established, and that should be the center for Jewish communal life. And the reason why this is pushed on the Jewish people at this point, and why the Jewish people ends up having a sanctuary and a temple, and later on the Beit HaMikdash, is because in the Middle East at that time, there was this practice called bamot. Bamot is basically pop-up altars. And every time people would make an altar, like a makeshift altar, they may be praying to a different god. So today they'll be praying to the sun. At night they may pray to the moon. If they feel like they're praying to the godheads of different animals, and so on and so forth. So Moses is very concerned that they're going to start making these altars ostensibly for God, but that they would somehow morph into these just pop up whatever the flavor of the day, the whatever was popular that day, and that it would turn into this basically an idolatrous group. And so he warns them about that. The other thing that Moses warns them about is the identifying signs for kosher animals and fish, which we know that the kosher animal is the animal that chews its cud and has split feet. And the fish is the fish that has the fins and the scales. Also, the Torah tells us that about the laws of the tithing, the giving the 10%, which is part and parcel of the Jewish tradition today to give charity, the Shemitah year, which we mentioned in the past, and the Shalosh Regalim. But what piqued my interest, because every time I study the Torah portion, I'm always like, okay, but we think we've done this. I think we've done that. What piqued my interest is two interesting laws. One is the law of the false prophet. And the other, which right away precedes the law of the false prophet, is the injunction of not adding or subtracting from the Torah. And this is what I want to make our conversation about today, the law of the false prophet. Now, in the Torah, Maimonides goes into detail about the laws of the false prophet. What is a false prophet? What makes someone a false prophet? So I just wanted to throw it out to you before we get into the text. Actually, let's get into the text first. Let me just find the text. Where is it? The Torah reading. Okay, here it is. Okay, so I want to get into the text first, and then once I get into the law of the false prophet, I want to just throw out to you what you would think would be the laws that would make the false prophet. Okay, so let me just share the screen with you right now. And here we go. We're in the Torah reading. Here we go. So here we go. We are here in this Torah portion in Perek Yud Gimel in chapter 13. We have the mitzvah, and the first mitzvah is Es kol hadavar asher anochi mitzavcha estam. Everything that I have commanded you, says Moses, also tishmeru. This is what you should keep and uphold, la'asos, and do. Lo tosef alav v'lo sigra mimenu. You shall not add to it, and you shall not subtract from it. So this is the preamble. And what's the law that follows this preamble? Ki yakum b'kirbecha navi. If a prophet arises amongst you, a cholem chalom, or a dreamer, v'nasan elecha os onofes, and he brings to you a sign and a wonder, and it goes on to teach what, and we're going to get into that in a second. So these are the two ideas that I want to talk to you about today. And I want to just throw it out to you. If you were talking about the laws of a false prophet, what do you think would entail a false prophet? What would be a false prophet? So just unmute yourself if you want to just jump in.
The one that claims himself to be the Messiah, Mashiach.
Okay, that's a good one. The one who claims to be the Mashiach. So that would be a sort of a false prophet, but how would you know if he was false? What would be the qualifications or the disqualifications of such a prophet? What would make a person a false prophet? Because if we believe in the Mashiach, and one day the Mashiach will come, then how do we know it's the Mashiach? Now, it's very interesting that Maimonides, who we mentioned many, many times, is probably the most pragmatic or rationalist rabbi in the Jewish tradition in terms of his approach. Now, one of the great contributions, and we spoke about this before, is that Maimonides compiled, by going through the Talmud, he compiled what he called the Mishnah Torah, the second Torah, or the Yad HaChazaka, the strong arm, and it is the codification of Jewish law according to the Torah. And Maimonides goes into great detail. So he will take a pasuk like this, and he will take a verse, a chapter, and he will then delineate the laws based on the discussion of all of the Mishnah and all of the Talmud. So what Maimonides essentially did in his Mishnah Torah was take the original verse in the Torah, find all the discussions about this in the Mishnah and in the Talmud and in the Agada and so on and so forth, and come out with a definitive law, so that a code of Jewish law. And over the years, I think it can be said very definitively that the way Maimonides rules in his Mishnah Torah, by and large, becomes accepted, because the work that Maimonides did was so comprehensive, to go through every source, to categorize every source. And so even though there may be slight differentiations in terms of, certain rabbis that will actually argue with Maimonides on his source or on his application, by and large, the laws, as Maimonides stipulates them, actually follow both the written Torah, so from the 5 books of Moses, and the rabbinic explanations to this. And one of the overarching themes, when one opens up Maimonides' work, he has an introduction to his, before he started teaching the laws, he has an introduction to how he deducted it and the chain of commands, as it were, so that he shows the delineation. And also, one of the principal, I think, overarching principles that Maimonides presents in his Yad Chazaka is the concept of the law of Moses, that Moses is the arbitrator of Jewish law. And anything that comes and tries to usurp Moses is a false prophet. So that the original 5 books of Moses is the gold standard, and the tradition is the way the rabbis have passed down the teachings from Sinai. And so we have this overarching concept of Moses is a true prophet, and what makes someone a false prophet is someone who tries to undermine or disregard or minimize what Moses taught us, okay? So it's very fascinating, and we're going to go into Maimonides itself. We're going to go into the laws of Maimonides itself. What Maimonides makes very, very clear is this. Someone mentioned before a false Messiah. So indeed, the Jewish history has been punctuated over time by false messiahs. People who claimed to be the Messiah, but turned out not to be. Now, there were certain messiahs that the rabbis speculated that they may be the Messiah, and they turned out not to be. But that was not a false Messiah. That was a Messiah that was not actualized, okay? What's the difference between a false Messiah and a Messiah that's not actualized? So let me give you an example. During the Roman occupation of Israel, of ancient Judea, there was a pushback by a man whose moniker, whose nom de guerre, as it were, was Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba means son of the star. In other words, he was a star. And Bar Kokhba led a somewhat effective rebellion against the Romans for about 5 years. And at one point, it seemed that Bar Kokhba, again, that was his moniker, would defeat the Romans, push them out of the land of Israel, and rebuild the temple. It seemed that that was the case. So there were some rabbis, including Rabbi Akiva, who saw Bar Kokhba as someone who was fighting on behalf of the Jewish people and who would redeem the Jewish people, as it were, from the Roman occupation of Judea. And as I mentioned, it seemed for a while that Bar Kokhba would be successful because he was able to push back on the Roman legions for 5 years. 5 years is not 5 minutes. 5 years is longer than a presidential term. And so at one point, it seemed that the tide was turning and Bar Kokhba was indeed winning. In fact, in Israel, they found recently, in the archaeological digs, they found coins, minted coins that were minted during the leadership of Bar Kokhba to show that, a coin was minted when there was something monumental happening. It was a milestone, right? So they found coins that were minted during the reign of Bar Kokhba that was like a coin that was really announcing that we're on our way back. And so Rabbi Akiva believed that Bar Kokhba was what we call a potential Mashiach. Now, in Jewish law, there's a distinction between a Mashiach Vadai, which is a certain Mashiach, and a Mashiach, a potential Mashiach. Okay, so we have a potential Mashiach, meaning someone who's showing signs of messianic leadership, and a person who actually is confirmed to be the Mashiach. Now, Maimonides makes it very clear, and perhaps because of the incident at Bar Kokhba, that a person can show signs of being a potential Mashiach, but they cannot be called a true Mashiach unless they bring peace to the land of Israel. That's going to take a lot. And they rebuild the temple. And then there's the ingathering of the exiles. So there's two stages in the Mashiach's revelation or coming. One is the potential Mashiach, the person who shows all the promise of being a Mashiach. And one is what we call the Mashiach Badai, the definite Mashiach. And that definite label goes on someone who has built the Beit HaMikdash and ushers in an era of peace. And Maimonides explains that the time of Mashiach is not going to be a supernatural time. People are very, very, when you talk about Mashiach, people are very worried about Mashiach. There's a joke that goes, there's a joke that goes like, this guy finally gets a cow or something. And then the rabbi says, like, Mashiach is going to come. He said, no, tell Mashiach, let him go somewhere else. I have my cow. Like, Mashiach is often when we're beset by problems and the problems seem insurmountable and we feel deluged by the problems. We say, we need Mashiach. But the minute our problems are solved, or whatever it is, if it's financial, if it's physical, if it's medical, we say, okay, fine, like everything's okay. But Maimonides explains in his laws about the coming of Mashiach and we're going to go into that in a few minutes. The time of coming of Mashiach, actually, you're going to have, life will be normal. The only difference will be is that there will be an era of peace in the world. And there's going to be a coming together. People will join for a higher purpose to bring peace, prosperity, health, preventative medicine, and so on and so forth. So back to this idea of the false Messiah and the false prophet. So how do we know if someone is a false prophet or a false Messiah? And indeed, as I mentioned, in Jewish tradition, there were several false messiahs. So how do we know if a person is a false messiah, or as opposed to a not confirmed messiah? Because there's difference between a not confirmed, like Bar Kokhba, who was a not confirmed messiah. He wasn't a false messiah. He didn't declare himself Mashiach. But everyone looked at him and said, maybe this is the Mashiach because look what he's doing. He's liberating us from the Romans. He's actually fighting the battle for the Jewish people to get back their homeland. So they saw him as a potential Messiah. Unfortunately, he was killed in battle. And when he was killed, he was obviously proven to be with only a potential and not in real life, in actuality. So what we have here essentially is what then defines a prophet, a false prophet or a true prophet. So very, very fascinatingly enough, and we're going to go into that because Maimonides goes into this in great length. What makes or breaks a prophet is not his or her spiritual or visual or miraculous tendencies or capacities, but rather their ability to lead the Jewish people in an upright fashion and uphold the laws of Moses. So what makes someone a false prophet is if they violate the tradition. That is what makes someone a false prophet, even if they are making great miracles, seemingly. That in of itself poses no truth. Okay, so let's go into the laws of Maimonides. Just going to find okay, here we go. Here, I'm just going to share this with you. Okay, so when it comes to the laws of Mashiach, okay, this is the English translation of the laws of Maimonides. And this is found, I'm just going to show you the source. This is found in the Mishnah Torah. So what I mentioned, the Yad HaChazaka, is called Hilchot Melachim, the laws concerning kings. Okay, it talks about the Messianic king, but we're going to go into the false prophet as well. But let's see what Maimonides says that I want to just highlight for you. Okay, look at this. And someone wants to read this? Someone wants to read this? This paragraph? Anyone?
Okay, I'll read it.
Go for it.
Do not think that the Messianic king will have to perform signs and wonders and bring about novel things in the world or resurrect the dead and other such things. It is not so. This is seen from the fact that Rabbi Akiva was a great sage of the sages of the Mishnah, and he was an armor bearer of King Bar Kotsiba.
Okay, so Bar Kotsiba is another name that the rabbis use for Bar Kokhba. Okay?
And said of him that he is the Messianic king, Rabbi Akiva, and all the wise men of his generation considered him to be the Messianic king until Bar Kotsiba was killed because of sins. And when he was killed, they realized that he was not, but the sages had not asked him for any sign or wonder.
Okay, so this is a very important aspect. And I think this is almost counterintuitive. What Maimonides posits here, when it comes to the laws of the Messianic king, and when it comes to the laws of prophets, is that one of the hallmarks that you would think when you talk about a spiritual leader, a king or a prophet, that, you know, especially a prophet, right, is that a prophet is this kind of like person who's in touch with the supernatural. So that you would say, if someone comes and does all these miracles, he walks on water or whatever it is, then we have to pay attention to them. But here, and then also in the laws of prophets, which we're going to touch on very shortly, Maimonides says very, very clearly, he will do not think that the Messianic king will have to perform signs and wonders and bring novel things into the world. That's not a sign of a prophet. And not only that, he emphasizes again that the sages had not asked for any sign or wonder. And what does he say instead? The essence of all of this is that the Torah, its statutes and its laws are forever and all eternity, and nothing can be added to them or diminished from them. And therefore, whoever adds or diminishes anything or interprets the Torah to change the plain sense of the commandments is surely an impostor, wicked, and a heretic. And in fact, what is the qualification for someone to be the Mashiach? So Maimonides says, anyone want to read this?
If a king arises from the house of David, who mediates on the Torah and occupies himself with the commandments like his ancestor David, in accordance with the written and oral Torah, and he will prevail upon all of Israel to walk in the ways of the Torah and strengthen its breaches, and he will fight the battles of God, it may be assumed that he is Mashiach. Okay, so you hear over here, Maimonides is making a distinction between the presumptive Mashiach and where we're allowed to presume that someone is Mashiach, but a presumptive Mashiach is not a definite Mashiach.
So Maimonides makes a distinction between someone who is a presumptive Mashiach and a definite Mashiach. And therefore, if someone is suspected almost, and because they're just such a great Jewish leader and does these things, that they can be presumed to be Mashiach, then that is a possibility. Now, Maimonides continues and he says, when do we know if he's a definite Mashiach? Okay, so anyone want to read this?
If he did these things successfully and defeated all the nations around him, built the sanctuary on its site,
The Beit HaMikdash.
and gathered the dispersed of Israel, he is definitely Mashiach.
Right.
He will then correct the entire world to serve God in unity, as it is said, for then I will turn to the peoples a pure tongue, that all shall call upon the name of God and serve him with one consent.
Okay, and here is an explanation that is in parentheses because it's not Maimonides' words, but it's if he did not succeed to that extent, or if he was killed in the process, it's clear that he's not Mashiach promised by the Torah, because he could be a great leader of the Jewish people, but the one who's going to be able to build the Beit HaMikdash and bring the Jewish people together, and then have the world follow, be like a world leader, that is then the what we call the Mashiach Vadai, the assumed Mashiach. So we have two types of Mashiach according to the Rambam, and there is the presumptive Mashiach and there is the assumed Mashiach. So the fact that someone is presumed to be Mashiach but does not actually end up being Mashiach is still within the rubric of the Jewish tradition. So what then is a false Messiah? What makes someone a false Messiah? Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What if they die of natural causes?
So that's a very good question. A very good question, because Maimonides uses the word, if he did not succeed or was killed. Maimonides does not say that he dies. He writes specifically that he was killed. So there's actually a big discussion amongst our sages. If Mashiach can be someone who will come from a different generation, like can it be a leader from the past? And that is a debate. So it's a debate with no clear answer. The Abarbanel, one of the great Jewish commentators, says that Mashiach can be from someone who had died and comes, like, let's say, when there's going to be the resurrection of the dead. How that happens exactly is unclear. But within the rubric of the Jewish framework, that is a possibility. Some people like to say no because it makes it complicated, and it's just clearer to say no. The Mashiach has to be from the living. However, Maimonides says very clearly that if the Mashiach is killed, the Mashiach is disqualified, and he does not use the word died. So it does leave a little bit of ambiguity, and there is a discussion amongst our sages, and there is not a clear consensus of what that means. So that's going to be one of those questions that we'll find out when Mashiach comes. But the question then the question is, what is a false Messiah? Because if Maimonides says that there's a presumptive Mashiach, I mean, someone could be presumed to be Mashiach and is not necessarily a false Mashiach, and then someone who is the definite Mashiach. So if you have the term that Maimonides uses in Hebrew is called Cheskas Mashiach and Mashiach Vadai. Cheskas means that they have all the qualifications, so there's a presumption. Okay. In general, in Jewish law, Cheskas means to hold, to have a stability, to have a strength. So it comes from the word chazak, right? So that but it means presumptive. So that's how Maimonides separates it: Cheskas Mashiach and Mashiach Vadai, presumptive Mashiach and the definite Mashiach. So obviously there was never a definite Mashiach, because we were still in a situation of galus. The question is then, what is then a false Messiah? If you have a presumptive Messiah and he doesn't or she doesn't end up being the Messiah, and then you have a certain Messiah, which we have not had yet, then what is a false Messiah? So what is a false Messiah? A false Messiah then is someone who proclaims themselves to be Mashiach, but does so in a way that makes the Jewish people violate or abnegate or delete or modify parts of the Torah. So a Mashiach that comes around and says, I am the Mashiach, however, now that I'm Mashiach, there are certain things in the Torah that no longer apply. This person is not considered a Mashiach. And we're going to go into that. Also, the idea of the false prophet. Let me just find this in a second. There we go. Okay. So here we have the, hold on. So find this. Okay. Here we have the laws of prophecy. So Maimonides starts off and he says that, very simply, he says, it is a foundational principle of Judaism that God does allow certain people to have inspired consciousness. They're able to have some kind of what we call nevuah, we call prophecy. Again, one of the problems that we always have is when we're talking about English words or words in English and Jewish terms, there's always this kind of cultural, what's the word I'm looking for? A cultural kind of overlap, so that because prophecy is an idea that's found in other cultures, when we translate nevuah to prophecy, we sometimes have that kind of meshing, or I don't know the word I'm looking for, this kind of like maybe misappropriation of the word. If you look at the Hebrew word for navi, naveh means to know, a knower. Nevuah is someone who has knowing. So what does Maimonides say that he says that this is given to Chacham Gadol b'Chachma, he has to be very wise, Gibor, he has to be strong, b'midosav. It means he has to have complete control of his personality. Can't be someone who gets angry, someone who gets depressed, someone who gets insulted, someone who's vengeful. He has to be a gibor b'midosav. It means an exemplary character. He has to be someone that you look up to and say, this is an exemplary person. And his own inclination should not be controlling him. But he should be in control of his inclination, so that you see a person who is really head and shoulders above others, in the sense that he's not controlled by his passion. He's not controlled by his emotion. He's not controlled by his inclination. Rather, he's a person that really is disciplined in and ethical and really a supermensch. And then Maimonides says, "V'hu baldeya rechava nevaina ad ma'id." He is a knower, a brilliant scholar, ad ma'id, exceedingly so. Okay, Adam shehu mimula b'chol hamidas ha'elu shalem b'gufa, a person who is completely complete. And then he goes on and he says that when he goes into the great ideas, he's able to come out, and so on and so forth. And Maimonides goes on to very, very long description. We don't, time does not allow for us to go into all the descriptions. And I'm just going to go forward a little bit. He talks about the different imageries that a person can have, and that not all prophets are on the same level. And there are people who are called the disciples of the prophets. He makes a different distinction between Moses and the other prophets. I'm just going to go a little bit because I want to go to a prophet that has a personal prophecy, and then I want to go to the point that I want to highlight. Someone who uses prophecy for the wrong purposes, and then I just want to go to the someone who destroys a sacred text, and so on and so forth. And Okay, I actually skipped a little too far. Let me go back. Okay, I'm going to find that in a minute. So let me just stop the share for a second. Okay. What Maimonides says, and I'm going to try to find the text, is that one of the things that we do not look for in a prophet, the one thing that we don't need to see in a prophet is miracles and wonders. So if someone comes to you and makes miracles and wonders, Maimonides says, don't be impressed, because anyone can do things with optical illusions. And here we have a distinction actually between Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maimonides being the Rambam and Nachmanides being the Ramban. So Nachmanides, who is more of a mystical bent, says, well, maybe some people actually can be really blessed to know how to perform miracles. And they may be performing genuine miracles. Maimonides says there is no such thing as a person who performs miracles. It's just optical illusions. So that even if a person performs it, the only true miracle is a miracle that comes from God. People cannot perform miracles. So, but Maimonides makes a very clear distinction. And he says, what makes a Messiah, the righteous Messiah, or what makes a prophet, a righteous prophet, it is not the fact that they can tell the future. It's not the fact that they know that they can perform miracles. And it's not the fact that they say things that will happen and they happen. Even though it is true that if someone starts telling you things that will happen and it happens, you could pay attention to them and say, 1 second, how did this person know this? Perhaps this person is blessed by divine revelation. But Maimonides says that's not in and of itself a proof. Rather, a prophet is someone who basically is a teacher of Torah and has like this seemingly a divine inspiration. And sometimes the prophet themselves is not even aware of their own divine inspiration, of their own ability to see. So Maimonides makes a distinction. So therefore, if anyone comes and says, I see the future, or someone comes and says, I see that I'm able to perform a miracle. Look how I'm able to do X, Y, and Z. Fill in the blanks. This in and of itself does not qualify anybody to be either a Mashiach or a king of the Jewish people or a prophet. Supernatural events, Maimonides posits, is not connected to being a proper prophet. So it's an interesting idea, because you would think that when we think about prophecy, we think about someone who is a prophet, a seer. Right away, we need to see miracles. We need to see that this person can do wonders. And now we could say, oh, perhaps they're a true prophet. Rather, the underlying principle of someone who is a prophet is someone who upholds the Torah and the mitzvot. And yes, it could be, Maimonides says, if someone shows signs of understanding the future, then you can see that if he says things that are going to happen and they happen, you can start paying attention to him, provided that he does not abnegate any part of the Torah. The minute he starts abnegating, deleting, modifying Torah, he's a false prophet, and actually he deserves capital punishment according to Maimonides and according to the Torah. So a false prophet is someone who says, here, I showed you a wonder. Now, let me just tell you something. This part of the Torah that you keep, it's no longer relevant. So back to the false Mashiach. What made a false Mashiach a false Mashiach? Let's say, for example, most notably in the last 500 years was Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was a Mashiach, a false Mashiach that came from Turkey, and the Jewish world was swept with news of his coming, as it were. But at the end, when the king there captured him, what did he do? He converted and said, now that I'm Mashiach, this is not applicable, that is not applicable. He broke in public many Torah laws and said, oh, that Mashiach is here, this is not applicable and that is not applicable. So it's very interesting that throughout our tradition, the overarching principle that we have in terms of what makes someone a true prophet, what makes someone a true Mashiach, what makes someone a true Jewish leader is their scrupulous allegiance to the Mosaic tradition. Anyone who devolves or mitigates or changes in any or it changes in any which way or form parts of the Jewish tradition, ipso facto becomes completely disqualified as a prophet, as a Mashiach. So the overarching principle is do not change the Torah. And it's interesting, just an aside, and I'm trying to find this text. I open all these texts on my computer and then they fall away. They go flying. I don't know where they went. I'm going to try to find it. Hopefully right before the class is over, I'll try to find it. But what's very interesting is this. Even when we talk about someone who gives prophecy, so someone says, such and such will happen, and then it happens. Maimonides says this: if someone gives a positive prophecy, so something good, says such and such will happen, let's say a blessing, right? Someone blesses someone, you will have a baby, or, there will be, the stock market will go up, or whatever it is, inflation will go down, or whatever it is that we consider to be good tidings. Corona will be cured. There will be no more Corona next year. It's going to be all gone. There's going to be a cure found for Corona, whatever beautiful prophecy. A person could come up and say, I have this intuition. This is what's going to happen. So it's very interesting. Maimonides says this: if a person says a positive prophecy and that prophecy comes to fruition, you have to pay attention to this prophet and see, perhaps they do know something. However, if they give a prophecy of gloom and doom, and the gloom and doom does not come to fruition, that does not in itself disqualify them as prophets, because we can change through merit. But if someone says something good is going to happen and that good thing doesn't happen, then you have to wonder if they're truly a prophet. So I'm gonna try to find the text. But what's very interesting, and I want to go back to the original text of this Torah portion, the Torah portion of Re'eh, where we talk about the prophet and the idea of the false prophet, most notably. So in this week's Torah portion, as I highlighted to you before, in verse 2, if there arises a prophet or a dreamer and gives you signs and wonders, so knowing how someone is a prophet, there's a preamble to this section, to the section of the false prophet and the true prophet, with this injunction: Eskol hadavar asher nechem mitzavchem l'asot tishmeru lasos. You have to keep everything I tell you. Moses is telling Jewish people, lo tosif olav lo tigra b'menu, do not add and do not subtract to it. So the preamble to knowing who is a prophet and who is not a prophet is already predicated in the Torah. The Torah begins before telling us about prophecy and who could be a prophet and what disqualifies a prophet, is the idea that first and foremost, the tradition cannot be modified. If the tradition is modified, that in itself is the end and the end of the prophecy. So the idea of not adding and subtracting. So here comes the obvious question that I'm sure you're going to ask, which is the question of, but what about the rabbis? Because we see sometimes rabbis do give, they seemingly add laws. So if anyone just can jump in and think of a law that is not necessarily biblical in nature, that we don't find biblical nature. In fact, we do speak, and you've heard me speak, and anytime we talk about Jewish law, we always make the distinction about, the laws that we call the laws of the Oraita, the laws of the original Torah text, and then the laws of the Rabbanan, the laws of the rabbis. So Judaism itself and the rabbis themselves distinguish between what they call, the Hilchos de Oraisa and Hilchos de Rabbanan, the laws that are predicated on the Torah itself and the laws that are predicated on the sages' understanding of the Torah. And the sages make a very clear distinction between that. So there's a much greater leniency in the laws of Rabbanan than there are the laws of Doraita. The laws of Doraita are immutable. The laws of Rabbanan, there's more leniency in terms of, it's a very, very long discussion, and not for this short time that we have, but suffice it is to say that this exists. So let me throw you some examples, or if you want, you can throw me some examples. Anyone want to pipe in there and think of a rabbinic law?
I just seem to remember something about organ transplantation, like heart transplant.
Okay, so you bring up a good point. So the rabbinic law, I would say first and foremost, there's three categories of rabbinic law. The first category of rabbinic law is rabbinic interpretation of Torah. So what we call in Hebrew the Masorah. The Masorah means the chain, like the chain of the tradition, further under tradition. So the tradition. So what we call Masorah. Masorah is the delineation of the Jewish law through the lens of the rabbinic understanding of the law. And of course, that's a whole discussion of how we get there. There's 13 principles of deduction that the Talmud has, and some of them are, it's too complex for the short time that we have, but suffice it is to say that this is the rabbinic interpretation or understanding of the law. So for example, I'm going to give you an example. It says that you shall wear totafot ben einacha. In the Shema, it says, you shall have totafot ben einacha. You shall have totafot between your eyes. What is totafot? So the rabbis say totafot are black boxes. That's a tefillin that men wear. They put between their eyes on their forehead and across their heart on their left arm. So how do you define totafot? So this is part of the rabbinic tradition, meaning that Moses, when he told them totafot, it's almost like the rabbis are the dictionary or the translators of the Torah, because when the Torah says totafot, what does totafot mean? So we have an oral tradition that went from Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, the prophets to the sages, and so on and so forth. That totafot are black boxes that have the Shema inside that we do on our foreheads. So there are certain parts of the Torah that we don't necessarily know. What does it mean? What is the meaning of the Torah? That is the oral tradition. So, for example, that we don't make a fire on Shabbat. The sages say you're not allowed to create a fire on Shabbat. The Torah says, Lo tivaru eish, you shall not create a fire. But the rabbinic tradition is you're not allowed to create a fire on Shabbat, but you can have a fire before Shabbat, let's say a light. You don't have to sit in darkness, right? So those people who didn't want to take the rabbinic tradition would sit in darkness all Shabbat. So lighting Shabbat candles to make sure that there is light before Shabbat is a rabbinic tradition, because there were people who believed that because it says in the Torah, Lo tivaru eish, you shall not create a fire, they sat in darkness all Shabbat. So for example, the idea of eating cholent or chamim or whatever it is in every tradition that we have comes from the idea that we're allowed to prepare something warm before Shabbat, because the understanding is that we're not allowed to create a fire, we're not allowed to create a new energy, but we're allowed to leave lights on, we're allowed to have light in the home, we don't sit in darkness. So that's an example of a rabbinic interpretation. In this case, when we have rabbinic interpretation of the law, that is considered to be like rabbinic law, like Torah law. It has the same status as Oraita. D'Rabbanan and Oraita are just almost the same status, because it is the understanding. It is the interface of us and God. The rabbis are there to teach us what is as they say, what is the definition of is? What is the definition of is? Sometimes when we have to just define what is means, so we have this interpretation. Then we have an idea called takanot or gzerot. Okay, so we have two ideas. We have a takanot. So takanot means, tikkun means fixings, right? So there are certain fixings that the rabbis made, and I'll give you an example of a fixing. On Shabbat, we're not allowed to write. Let's say we're not allowed to draw. We're not allowed to create. So the rabbis made a rule that they called it the laws of muksa, the laws of touching. And basically they said, and it's understood that this is a rabbinic injunction, that, you know what, since you're not allowed to color on Shabbat, and since you're not allowed to draw on Shabbat, do not touch something that you're not allowed to use. So for example, don't touch a pen. This is called muksa. So this is a takana, okay? And how did the rabbis have permission to do that? If it says don't add and don't subtract from the Torah, how did they have permission to say don't touch a pen? Or, for example, don't touch a candle on Shabbat. It doesn't say you're not allowed to touch a candle in the Torah. It says you're not allowed to light a fire in the Torah. So a candle that has no flame on it, I'm not really violating Torah precepts if I touch it. So why did the rabbi say don't touch a candle? Because they understood human nature. I'll be touching the candle, the next thing I know, I may light it. I will be touching a pen, the next thing I know, I'll be doodling. So this is called takanot that are siyag. They are fences. And the rabbis basically made a fence, and they said, don't do this so you don't come to that. So this is based on there's a verse in the book of Vayikra that says, and it's a mitzvah, Vishamru shomateha, that you should guard the guardings. That means that there's a mitzvah to be careful with a mitzvah. So sometimes you will do certain things not to come to certain things. And the analogy I'll give is, let's say in popular psychology, if somebody is a known alcoholic and has an alcohol dependency, what do you say about such a person? Don't touch a bottle of alcohol. Why? Because you may come to drink from it. So the same is true. The rabbis have takanot where they put in certain, what we call a siyag. They put a fence around the Torah so that we don't come to violate the next step. And this is not adding to the Torah. Why is this not considered adding to the Torah? This is not considered adding to the Torah because there is a precept, a biblical precept that says you should guard that which has to be guarded. And based on this, the rabbi said we're putting this together so that people can be careful. Now, that being said, let's say, for example, you have a pen on your table and it's Shabbat and you forgot to take it off before Shabbat. And you don't want it on your table. You want to remove it, but you're not allowed to touch it because it's Shabbat. But you're not allowed to touch it because it's muksa. Muksa is a rabbinic siyag. So the rabbis then allow that you can move it using something else. Like, for example, you can use a book to push it off. You don't touch it with your hand. And again, that's another siyag. So you could move it because you need a space or it's not nice to have it on the table, but you can't touch it with your hand. And the reason is if you touch it with your hand, you might come to write. So these are a series of enactments. Okay. And then again, yes, someone pointed out chicken and milk. Perfect example, Lise, thank you. The Torah says that we shall not cook the goat in his mother's milk. And the rabbis said that it's preferable. They made a law that a person shouldn't eat chicken and milk together. And why was this? Because chicken and meat both are flesh. And sometimes it is once it's been prepared, you can get confused between one and the other, and you'll end up violating a very serious precept of eating milk and meat together. So therefore, the rabbis added chicken to the violation of not eating milk and meat together. So that's again another what we call a takana. It's a kind of a fence that they put around a mitzvah to make sure that the mitzvah is kept. And lastly, there's something called a gezerah or a specific ordinance. So for example, a gezerah is a law that rabbis will make for a specific time in a specific place and for a limited time or for a limited community. So for example, I'll give you an example that Rabbeinu Gershom made a gezerah. He made a injunction that a man should not have more than one wife. But he only made this injunction to the Ashkenazic community in Germany. And anyone who followed the laws of the Ashkenazic community in Germany did not take a second wife. He also said for 1,000 years. Because technically you're not allowed to add a new mitzvah to the Torah. So you are allowed to make a gezerah. Now, no one can just go ahead and make gezerot. You have to have the leadership of a huge community to do that. However, A rabbi in a congregation can make a gezerah like no cell phones, even on the weekdays, right? No cell phones in the synagogue. I don't want anyone coming with cell phones. In his school, in his yeshiva, he could say, I don't want such and such. That is understood that for people who follow them, that there's a kind of a protective measure, but they can't add anything. It's like if you say to someone, we don't want you to bring a cell phone into synagogue, it's to protect the sanctity of the synagogue, not because he's making a law about cell phones, right? So if someone says, don't use the internet, there are rabbis that say, don't use the internet. On what basis can they say, don't use the internet? How is that not adding to the Torah? Well, we are using the internet. How is that not adding to the Torah? They'll say, because the internet is a dangerous place. A person can come and get involved in websites that are terrible. And if they don't have filters or whatever it is, and they'll end up violating the Torah. So for that community, that becomes a precept. But it's not adding to the Torah. It's really strengthening an existing Torah idea, which is, Ushmartem, you should have shmiras einai, and you should watch what you see. It says in the Shema, Lo sasuru achrei levavchem va'achrei einechem asher Hashem tereim re'isamen. So you're not allowed to follow your eyes and your heart for negative things. So here the rabbis will say, okay, it says in the Torah, you're not allowed to have your eyes lead you astray. Be careful what you see. So here again, it is a protection of the existence. So this is just in a nutshell. When the rabbis are doing things, they're not adding. They are strengthening the Torah, and they're certainly not allowed to delete mitzvot, and they're not allowed to add new mitzvot. Because when you add new mitzvot, unless you are the Sanhedrin, you are making up stuff. So it's a very fascinating look. That being said, the Torah is a living organism. In other words, you brought up the idea of organ transplants. What about in vitro fertilization? We're now on the cusp of great scientific discovery, genetic modification. What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? Is in vitro fertilization permitted in Jewish law? And amazingly enough, in vitro fertilization, the laws for in vitro fertilization, and by the way, in vitro fertilization is a very comprehensive and complicated area of Jewish law, but the rabbis do have guidelines. And in fact, one of the most advanced countries in vitro fertilization is Israel. And the reason for that is because there is a framework. While everyone is trying to find out, is it ethical to create embryos that you may not use? And what happens with those embryos because it's pre-life? And what does that mean? The rabbis already have a rubric for a framework for dealing with these issues, because in the Talmud, we already have ideas of potential of in vitro fertilization. So we have that rubric. And so is it a new law when we're talking about in vitro fertilization? Is it a new law when we're talking about organ transplants? No, it's taking precepts that we have that are very established and attaching it to the realities. That being said, in the area of organ transplant, there's two approaches to certain types of transplants and what constitutes death. Is it brain death? Is it cardiac death? And this is a hotly debated, and there are great sages on both sides of the divide. Being that it's a new technology, it's not so clear cut. This is also true with in vitro fertilization. Certain types of vitro will be permitted, certain will not be permitted. But suffice it is to say that there are thousands and thousands of Torah observant Jews who have availed themselves to in vitro fertilization and thus been able to have children. In fact, there's a whole organization in New York called Bonei Olam that is dedicated to helping couples who have difficulty having a biological child have one through in vitro fertilization. So all this to say that the Torah is a living water because our roots are very, very deep. The infrastructure is very, very deep, and we follow the tenets. We have not shifted away from the tenets. We follow the tenets, but we apply it to our time and our generation. And therefore, the great Torah scholars and the sages who understand the fast response of Jewish law and the devolvement of Jewish law can and do learn to apply where and how new technologies and new emerging realities are dealt with in our day and age. So it's a fascinating idea, and yet the fidelity to the law of Moses is paramount. So no matter the miracles and no matter the magic, Jewish people are not attracted to crying statues. Jewish people are not attracted to the miraculous, because we are ourselves a miracle people. What makes us connected is the truth and the fidelity to the Mosaic code. And this is one of the great recurring themes that Maimonides repeats in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, in his laws of kings, in his laws of the false prophets, and throughout, that the fidelity to the Masorah, the fidelity to the interpretation and the tradition is what will continue the Jewish tradition forevermore. May it be very soon that we do witness the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and we do witness a time that the world will be a world that is suffused with harmony and led by those who want to bring peace between peoples and understanding, and to have healing, not only healing, but healing a proactive of healing. There was one time there was a doctor that came by the Rebbe, and they introduced him and said he's a very big doctor. I forgot, he was a big doctor, scientist. And the Rebbe said to him, I bless you that you should be out of work. And he was like, that you shouldn't have your job anymore, something like that. Like, and he visibly was shaken up. And the Rebbe said, no, you misunderstand my blessing, that you should be involved in preventative medicine. Not that you will no longer need to heal people, but you will have a protocol to prevent people from even falling ill. And that is really what we all hope for. So as we are going into the new year, and we are now past, we're getting closer to Elul. These are beautiful sentiments to know that the Torah does believe in a time that there will be true leadership. So despite the fact that we're surrounded by leadership that is sometimes we call it false prophets, and certainly people who are in politics usually are driven by their own self-agendas, we look forward to that day. The Torah gives us a very clear denunciation of what it means to be a leader. It's not someone who makes magic. It's not someone who can pull the wool over your eyes, and it's not even someone who can do anything that's supernatural. It's someone who has wisdom and fidelity to our Torah. So that's the short of it. The long of it, probably we could do a whole series, and maybe one day we will, on the Masorah, which is very, very fascinating and actually quite scientific. People think that we have this kind of blind allegiance to rabbis, and it just, we just listen to the rabbis. That's true, because when we lack knowledge, we do have to have that kind of blind allegiance. You can't. It's like a doctor in medicine who you listen to. You say to the doctor, "What should I do?" You can get a second opinion or whatever it is, but there's a certain kind of humility in the face of the doctor, knowing that this doctor went to medical school and is doing research. And so that is the same with our law. The rabbis are not magicians. They are always. A great rabbi was always called a Talmid Chacham, or in the Sephardic tradition, the Chacham, the wise man. And really that is the essence of the way the Torah is devolved, is through wisdom and understanding and a divine and a will to have a divine connection. So that's the short and long of it. I hope this was an interesting topic. I find it very, very fascinating. And thank you for joining me, and wishing everyone a very inspired week. We can all have our little bits of prophecies in our own lives in a positive way.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you.
interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for joining me, everyone. Have a wonderful week and enjoy the sunshine.
Yes.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.